Adelperi Nadishnakas, Gawin Nijudemsi, Winnipeg Ninduji, Zaganashkwe Ninda. My name is Adelperi. I don't know my clan. I live in Winnipeg and I teach here at the University of Manitoba, the Departments of History and Women's and Gender Studies.
Too quiet.
Too quiet? Okay. So I'll stand up so I can project a little bit. And one of the hats that I wear here at the university is as the director of the Center for Human Rights Research. Our work is based here at the University of Manitoba's Fort Garry campus, located in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Métis people, governed by the promises and relations of Treaty 1 and of the Manitoba Act, what Riel sometimes called the Manitoba Treaty. Our drinking water comes from Treaty 3 to the east. Our hydroelectric power comes from our relations and friends to the north and to the west. Both our water and our power have come and continue to come at ongoing expense of people in Treaty 3 and in Treaty 5. And it is amid all of these ongoing histories that the Center for Human Rights Research does the work that we do, which is to coordinate and promote research that is concerned with human rights and Indigenous rights, defined broadly and always in interconnected ways. I'm also somebody who has spent an ill-advised amount of time on social media, and like many kind of questionable life choices, occasionally they pay off. And one way that paid off for me is a couple of months ago, I saw a tweet from Dr. Jeffrey Ansloos announcing that he was coming home to Treaty 1 and was interested in presenting his work. And I thought, what an opportunity for us here. I have followed Dr. Ansloos's work for a little while, and both Dr. Pauline Tennant, the Center for Human Rights Research Manager, and very much key to everything that we do, and I had both just had the opportunity to hear an episode of Media Indigena focused on questions of water insecurity and First Nations communities and suicide, featuring Dr. Ansloos making connections, I think really vital connections, between conditions of unlivability and Indigenous life. And these connections that Dr. Ansloos are making are game-changing. They are the kind that once you have thought, you cannot unthink. So we're enormously honored that Dr. Ansloos is able to share some of this work with us here today. Jeffrey Ansloos has a Ph.D. He is an associate professor of Indigenous Health and Social Policy and the Canada Research Chair in Critical Studies in Indigenous Health at the University of Toronto. He holds appointments at Oisey's Institute for Studies in Education, the School of Cities, and the Waakebiness-Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health. His scholarship examines social, political, environmental, and affective dimensions of Indigenous health inequality, focusing on suicide, housing, and mental health and policing. Dr. Ansloos directs the Critical Health and Social Action Lab, a hub for community-engaged research and action for health justice and communities, funded by CHRR, the Canadian Institute for Health Research, and the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. He is a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College for New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. He is a citizen of Fisher River Cree Nation and of Cree and English origin, and he is born and raised in Treaty 1. Dr. Ansloos will be speaking today on When the Land Hurts, Indigenous Feminism on Suicide, Environmental Justice, and the Struggle for Inhabitability. Couple of logistical notes. There's men's and women's washrooms right across the hall. There is a gender-neutral washroom upstairs in the general office. We are recording this event. We're not 100% sure where that recording is going to land, but if that is sort of a concern, you can maybe let Dr. Tennant in the blue there waving and myself know, and we will find ways to accommodate your concerns. These are also questions that, of course, are complicated and difficult, and we have a few posters that we've distributed around the room that have QR codes and phone numbers for relevant sort of supports that people might access if they need them around this or anything else. So with all of that, let me say how great it is to see so many people out here on a June day to hear this important work. And I'm really honored to turn things over to Dr. Ansloos.
Thanks, Adele. Okay. Hi, everybody. Tanse. It's good to be with you. So as Adele just mentioned, today's discussion will explore some sensitive themes related to the violence of environmental racism and suicide among Indigenous communities. And I understand that these topics evoke very strong emotions and personal connections for a lot of people, myself included. And I appreciate that your heart and love for community may have drawn you to a talk like this, as somebody influenced or impacted by suicide and environmental violence. And even though the topic can be painful, and I want to acknowledge those here with lived and living experiences with these issues, and to just convey my respect for your wisdom in guiding how you might participate in this space over the next hour. I want to encourage you all to approach this time with a good heart, and a good mind, with care and compassion for all that the topics can stir, including pain. I want to remind everyone to prioritize their well-being. If at any point you feel overwhelmed, it's really important to trust yourself, trust your body, and know that I value and respect your self-determination and fully support you to take the time, to take the exits, to take the space and care that you need. Feel free to step away, reach out to folks here at the center, use the QR codes, and connect with people who are really interested in caring and speaking with you here at the university and beyond for support. We're here to create a safe and respectful space with one another. And I want to acknowledge also that our traditional traditions, as Indigenous people, we have knowledges about such topics, which tell us that these issues are also spiritual. That even speech about these topics can invoke and holds great power. And as such, we need to proceed with spiritual care. So if you want to smudge at any point or nourish your own life, your strength, I'm not really sure actually what the culture or politics of this are at a place like U of M, but I love the smell of our medicines, and a human rights informed approach to Indigenous post-secondary education should ensure you the space and accommodation to smudge and pray as needed and desired. And so since hopefully none of us are acting as police or Indian agents, let's feel free to make this space safer together. And thank you for your understanding. And let's just proceed with empathy and consideration for each other. I want to start in a good way and acknowledge that today we're gathered in the territories of many nations. One thing I love about Winnipeg is that here many nations make their home on the same land, a place governed by treaties, which I also want to acknowledge, both the numbered ones made with occupying colonial crowns and the ones our people have had for much longer with the lands and waters. We build lodges in sacred spaces, and so at the confluence of two rivers moving north, muddy with deep stirring of the earth, we've built a lodge as a treaty with this land, to live in a good way, to uphold one another, to protect the sacred. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, those who are about the good work in our communities today, those that are with us. Miigwech for your love. My name is Jeffrey Ansloos. I was born and raised not too far from here on Treaty 1 territory. I'm kind of an alum of sorts of University of Manitoba, where I completed my residency and mini university. And while my family ties me to southern Manitoba all the way to the north, Winnipeg has always been home. My mother, born Lisa Dawn Stevenson, or by the name that many and some of you might know her as Sherry Ansloos. She's an artist and a longtime educator in St. James School Division. Her mother, Selena Moggy, and before marriage Stevenson, was born and raised in Fisher River. Her and a long lineage of families, including Stevenson, Oigs, Garsons, Bushies, Crates, hail from Fisher River and from Norway House. My father, Paul Ansloos, who I get this uncommon last name from, was an immigrant to Canada from the United Kingdom. And my mom and dad met in high school in a small town in southern Manitoba, serendipitously named Manitou or Manado. And the rest, they say, is history. I've come to you today as a lifelong learner of my culture and our ways, as someone who, along with my family, is on a lifelong journey of healing from the impacts of colonialism, which are felt deeply in our life. And as someone who's passionately committed to the movement for Indigenous life and the inhabitability of our planet. I'm a little nervous today to be home and sharing these words. It's a different expectation, I think. But in the great words of Louis Riel, in a little while, it will all be over. And if we fail, we fail, but the rights for which we contend for will not die. So as we gather, I'd like us to pause and reflect on the backdrop against which we find ourselves doing human rights research. Across Turtle Island, wildfires are raging, scorching thousands of hectares of land and sending massive plumes of chemicals into the sky. And images like these and statistics fill our headlines and newsreels, becoming an unsettlingly familiar narrative. Fields and even water aflame. Towering smoke reaching into sky world, and most painfully, entire ecosystems seemingly vanishing in an instant. Or if you're an Indigenous person living on a First Nation reserve anywhere north of the 2-hour radius where the majority of white Canadians live, work, and play, you might see flames in real life. You might feel those flames in your house, on your land, the ash on your skin. Of course, none of this is instantaneous. Human-induced climate change plays a significant role. As Heather Davies and Zoe Todd remind us, these shifts are part of a broader continuum of anthropocentric violence marked by 500 years of settler colonialism in the Americas, fueled by industrial activities such as large-scale deforestation, fossil fuel consumption, significant carbon emissions. Our global climate has undergone radical and rapid shifts. The IPCC reports that human activities have caused profound changes to the effect that our global temperatures are rising to a point which will lead to further catastrophic consequences for our world. And this is evident very immediately in the iceless summers in the north. The disappearance of the permafrost line near many of our hometowns and reserves, and over 30% increase in extreme wildfire weather in regions like Manitoba. This isn't a natural cycle, as some pundits in the extremely polarized conservative media would have us believe. It's driven by human action, colonial human action. And the environmental devastation we're witnessing isn't an isolated or local phenomena. It's a multi-scalar result of global extractivism, the large-scale extraction and consumption of natural resources spanning forests, minerals, water, and more, primarily by industrialized countries, including Canada. This extractivism, this global capitalist economy, which seeks perpetual growth on a planet with finite resources, fuels the crisis and profoundly affects regions both close to and distant from zones of extraction, fallout zones of Canadian mining companies like First Nations. The repercussions of this relentless exploitation are evident across all scales, local, regional, national, and global. And the web of connections links deforestation in places like the Amazon with the melting ice caps in Inuit Nunavut. The overproduction of industrial waste with the rise of disease in our fisheries. Let's bring it closer to home. In places like Manitoba, the stakes couldn't be higher. The implication of global extractivist industrial complex manifests in a myriad of ways. Flooded by Manitoba hydrodamming, wildfires exacerbated by drier weather conditions, and increasingly frequent and severe heat waves that threaten public health. More frequent blight in corn, water and soil contamination from industrial activities, and even once improbable weather events like cyclones are increasing on the prairies. The land is hurting. These events impact the land, but they also disrupt the lives of those who inhabit it. Increased toxicity levels threaten communities' health and well-being, along with all of our relations, including plantkin and waterkin and other creatures. Our communities' ways of life, knowledge of the planet, are particularly vulnerable to these disruptions, pushing already marginalized communities into further risk and precarity. To make matters worse, these profound environmental challenges are fueled by a political and economic structure bent on further extraction. The adoption of neoliberal policies in the face of escalating environmental precarity compounds these issues, especially for First Nations. Neoliberalism, market deregulation, privatization, fiscal austerity often results in reduced public spending on vital public infrastructure, social services, environmental protections. For First Nations in Manitoba, the effects are clear. The shutting down of multiple social service institutes serving First Nations in the North End. Shoal Lake in Ontario, Niskandiga, Split Lake, Matthias Clum, Shamattawa, Saisi. Many of these communities suffer from federally underfunded water sanitation infrastructure that fails to meet their basic needs. And yes, a fundamental right to water, even as they face heightened risks from environmental hazards. So where does it end? From mold and temporary housing built in the 50s that was never supposed to be permanent, and now, decades later, can't possibly be safe during hot weather events, to poor air circulation or failing wastewater systems, leaving entire communities vulnerable. This infrastructural neglect, this infrastructural violence magnifies the pain. The land is hurting, and so are we. When the land hurts, what happens? This is the context in which I wish to start today's talk on the topic of yet another state of emergency, the issue of suicide in many First Nations. And while it may seem like an unusual starting place to some, I hope that through the course of this time together, we might come to see these as inextricably connected, and that our way through these emergencies is inextricably connected. Suicide has emerged as a crucial issue in our time. Its global rates exhibiting an upward trend over the last few decades, and according to the WHO, an estimated 800,000 people die annually each year around the globe to suicide. Canada, home of the fastest growing Indigenous population in the world, bears a disproportionate burden of the issue. Disturbingly, both Indigenous peoples and notably Indigenous youth endure suicide rates starkly higher than the public, a fact underscored by a recent report from Stats Canada in 2019. This disparity is stark. Suicide rates among First Nations are approximately 3 times those to the general population, and in some contexts, disturbingly higher, upwards of 20. And furthermore, there's data spanning 6 decades that points towards an upward trend in suicide among Indigenous peoples globally. And most poignantly among First Nations, suicide ranks as the leading cause of death among youth and adults under the age of 44. The watershed publication of Choosing Life, a special report by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1995, was the first major policy document to cast a spotlight on this reality. The report observed that the number of Indigenous youth dying by suicide was rising, and it went on to predict and urgently caution that these rates would swell over the ensuing 10 to 15 years. And regrettably, this prediction holds true even now, more than 25 years later, as suicide rates have steadily climbed and there's no indication of decrease. At the time, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples identified an intricate array of contributing factors related to suicide risk among First Nations, and they encompass these 4 categories. Biopsychological factors, so things like individual mental health issues or behavioral issues, depression, substance use, were both identified as potent risk elevators. Situational factors like disruptions in family life related to child welfare policies or exit from community due to hospitalization needs in the city also contributed substantially. And socioeconomic factors like lower income level or educational attainment were also identified. And then this kind of peculiar 4th factor, which was cultural stress, as if culture is stressful. It's just a strange frame to me. But what they're actually talking about here is the disruptions caused by dislocation of Indigenous people from their families and language and culture due to child welfare policies and removal from land. In the ensuing years, demographic factors such as age and gender and geographic location, particularly we now know that young men aged 15 to 25, those residing on reserves with limited access to mental health services, are among the greatest at risk in Indigenous communities. And in 2019, Stats Canada released a report talking about socioeconomic conditions, and when factoring for household income, labor force status, education level, and relationship status, these factors accounted for 66% of suicide risk after accounting for gender and age. So the inequalities are very stark and present, but what has these many decades of research on risk factors amounted to in terms of prevention? Despite significant investments in public health and suicide research, the persistence and growth of suicide rates is concerning. Canadian suicide prevention strategy, while acknowledging a range of contributing factors, is overwhelmingly dominated by a medicalized risk model and the central promotion of mental health services as the solution. So as a caveat, I will come out of the closet and say I'm a professional psychologist by training. And so while I'm not opposed to or at the extreme end that might maybe completely reject the value of such approaches like medicine or mental health services, I nonetheless believe that this strategy often and more often overlooks the critical impact of material risk environments. When we understand the phenomena of suicide primarily through the lens of models which say that it is always the product of mental illness, we fail to grapple with how suicide and suicidal people are existing in a context, located critically in relevant socio-ecological dimensions, for even something like mental illness is somewhat technically structured. My colleague Jennifer White, widely regarded as the leading voice in critical suicide studies, has argued that within mainstream suicidology, suicide is often perceived as a static, individual, or identifiable phenomena. This conventional view of suicidology and suicide prevention adopts individualistic, psychiatric, and positivist lens on research that largely focus on mental health problems, biological or genetic predispositions, personality traits, cognitive characteristics in individuals, and see these as being perceived as the primary factors leading to suicide risk. Simplified, White's critique underscores the reductionist tendency to interpret suicide mainly as the product of depression or addiction, while largely neglecting the socio-cultural and historical contexts that significantly affect suicide rates. To kind of explore this critique a little further, I just pulled up the main risk factors identified in the 2013 National Aboriginal Youth Suicide Prevention Strategy. The first one, addictions. And as you look through this list, while these factors are undoubtedly pertinent and substantial, White's argument illuminates for us the ways that this list largely emphasizes individual circumstances, and even while it acknowledges some social conditions, it looks at these things primarily through the lens in a way that might be described as heavily depoliticized. The approach bypasses broader structural drivers contributing to Indigenous youth suicide prevalence. So where are the acknowledgements of enduring colonial policies, persistent racial apartheid, or systematic socioeconomic structured inequality that disproportionately affect our communities? By focusing primarily on individual risk factors, we risk overlooking a comprehensive picture, a panorama that encapsulates historical violence, continuous violence, and the systemic failure to provide an adequate socio-cultural, economic, and environmental theory of justice. Moreover, in failing to do so, we run the risk of reducing what is perhaps so profoundly important about what suicide reveals about the world we inhabit. As an Indigenous studies scholar deeply invested in mental health research, I've devoted the last several years to investigating a central question. What unique perspectives can Indigenous studies bring to suicide research? Vine Deloria, arguably one of the founders of the field of Indigenous studies in its contemporary form, compellingly posited that Indigenous studies demonstrates the insufficiency of Western knowledges in their propensity to abstract, decontextualize, and overlook the temporal facets of Indigenous existence, traits that underpin colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and racism. And I see a similar tendency in suicidology, where the high incidence rates of suicide among Indigenous people are abstracted from context, and the temporal pressures exerted on Indigenous life are frequently dismissed, neglected, or at worst, treated as invalid. Indigenous studies, in contrast, aspires to illuminate all aspects of Indigenous life and death, including the spatial and material aspects. It highlights the significant impact of place-based knowledge, or as my mama would say, land is what it's all about. Our quest as Indigenous people for liberation from colonialism is intimately connected to our knowledge of land-based dimensions. Or put another way, how the land feels tells us a great deal about how we feel. Understanding our bodies in context is a crucial conceptual contribution of Indigenous studies. This knowledge holds potential for informing how we respond to embodied issues like suicide. If we accept that the goal of Indigenous studies is to generate knowledge that facilitates Indigenous life, our liberation from oppression, our thriving, and the rejuvenation of our land, then this becomes an indispensable analytic lens to apply to suicide, which arguably is a study of a phenomena which materially marks the end of our lives. In some of my formative work on the subject, in papers like Rethinking Suicide, or in A Question of Justice, critically researching suicide with Indigenous studies of affect, and in a forthcoming book entitled Against Annihilation with UBC Press, I've been thinking with Indigenous feminists like Audra Simpson, Leanne Simpson, Eve Tuck, Billy Ray Belcourt, Diane Million, Erica Violet Lee, and Zoe Todd, among others. And their scholarship, particularly their emphasis on the interrelationship between land, bodies, and emotions. And I believe this body of work has some profound implications for helping us think about suicide. For example, I've been thinking with Indigenous feminist claims about the relationship between sovereignty, land, and bodies, and I probed the question that if we consider an Indigenous person's body as a political entity and one which embodies the conditions of sovereignty of our nations, as Audra Simpson invites us to consider, how does suicide, which is quite literally the annihilation of a body, inform us about the conditions of occupation under the settler colonial nation state? Similarly, Billy Ray Belcourt has suggested a crucial link between Indigenous life and sickness, including, I would argue, suicidality, in an era where health is measured by an individual's ability to navigate the structural pressures inherent in settler colonialism. Belcourt underscores the fact that bodies are shaped and influenced by larger structures, and in this case, settler colonial technologies. And these influences can manifest in a range of affective ways. And this has really helped me reconsider the common conception of depression and how relationships between Indigenous peoples and colonial structures yield specific emotional realities like suicide, where suicide can be understood as emerging as a political response to manufactured sorrow where joy has been shut out of everyday life for a long time. These affective conditions of unlivability, born out of attempts to survive within a violent context, compel us to critically examine our society and the limits of our ethical imaginations in envisioning a future free from occupation. The high mortality rates impacting Indigenous youth and the normalization of such a tragic reality should evoke widespread public outrage. Yet these alarming circumstances are often met with indifference or with a more latent racism. The violations of our rights are treated as exceptional. Our lives, it seems, exist in a prolonged state of being near death that seldom draws the concern it deserves. And while suicide prevention research typically focuses on preserving life, Indigenous feminists help us to assert that the circumstances of Indigenous life under colonial rule are essentially unlivable unless we concurrently address the context in which Indigenous life and indeed death are embedded. These contexts or risk environments substantially shape our capacity to live, let alone flourish. Erica Violet Lee poignantly framed it, the degradation of our lands and waters into wastelands, or fallout zones of occupation, or the relegation of Indigenous spaces to non-places, deemed disposable and subjected to enforced biosocial apartheid and despair, as Billy Ray Belcourt has suggested. These are the contexts of suicide. These insights from Belcourt and Lee serve as a vital reminder that suicide and our pursuit of defining what constitutes a livable life is connected to land. What's our ethical responsibility? How do we better respond to and incorporate that kind of knowledge in our approaches to suicide prevention? The path forward must be one that fully acknowledges and addresses the impact of these broader structural influences on suicide among Indigenous communities. And this leads me to the work of Diane Million, who provides crucial insight into the role of affect in the context of Indigenous peoples' experiences with colonialism and gender-based oppression. Million calls us to comprehend colonialism as it is felt by those who experience it, a directive that has guided me in pondering the knowledge imparted by individuals with suicidality, or even more difficultly, by those who have died by suicide and those of us left in the wake. Million posits that to decolonize means to understand as fully as possible the forms that colonialism takes in our own times, even if it departs from the commonly held imparted wisdom that suicide is because we're depressed. This includes the daunting task of acknowledging the damaging effects of colonialism even when they manifest in devastatingly personal and individual experiences, such as suicide. Million also makes the point that our felt knowledges are sacred. They hold power. By emphasizing feelings, even the unspeakable ones, she demonstrates that our emotional experiences or felt theories play a crucial role in building public awareness and power to confront and mitigate the effects of structural violence, moreover, to challenge their foundation. Power accumulates because these emotional narratives can contest and overturn prevailing narratives about Indigenous peoples' lives and deaths, especially those imposed by colonial authorities, academics, and self-proclaimed experts like psychologists. These alternative narratives provide crucial insights into our lived realities and have the potential to shift understanding and spur meaningful change precisely because they point to the sites of needed action. And before I dive a little further into how this kind of analysis is shaped by applied research, I want to shift gears for a moment and share a story that some of you will likely remember. Back in 2016, the First Nation at Waakebiness-Bryce declared a state of emergency in response to a shockingly high number of suicide attempts. It briefly dominated the news headline, reminiscent of how things unfolded in Red Sucker Lake First Nation in Manitoba earlier this year, in the public conscience for a moment, and then silence. In the span of a few short months, over 100 suicide attempts were documented within this community of 2,000 residents, with a harrowing 11 attempts in a single night. Heartbreakingly, some of those attempts were by people as young as the age 11. The narrative that quickly emerged in media coverage was that this distressing situation was a call for urgent mental health resources, support services, and suicide prevention efforts. When emergency response workers visited at Waakebiness-Bryce and engaged young people in dialogue about the challenges they were facing, they asked an interesting question. What does the community need to live well? Let's take a moment to consider their responses. Reviewing this list, many items didn't surprise me. I expected to see things related to recreation, youth services, mental health, and culturally focused programming. All indicated in an Indigenous suicide prevention research sort of literature for the last 30 years. But there were some things that stood out, jumped out really at me, demanded my attention, and that was the call for more firefighters, dust control, shelters, and meeting with the Prime Minister of Canada. Bear in mind, these requests by young people, youth, directed and directly affected by suicide in their community within hours of this gathering, speak to the complex web of needs beyond clinical mental health intervention. These are political matters, matters connecting suicide to the health of the land, the power dynamics of Indigenous people with the occupying nation state, and dust. Why dust? At Waakebiness-Bryce's dust and pollution problems are largely linked to the industrial activities of De Beers Canada, a multinational mining corporation with activity all over the Canadian North and in Australia. While the mine brought some mining companies are proliferating all over the world, but in 2008, De Beers opened the Victor Mine, an open-pit diamond mine just 90 kilometers west of the community. And while the mine brought some economic benefits to maybe Ontario, it has had serious environmental impacts, and in particular in communities like Waakebiness-Bryce. The mining process generates significant amounts of dust and debris which carried by the wind and water into nearby communities. And Attawapiskat has long raised concerns about the air and water quality, as well as the potential health impacts of this kind of extractive resource development in their community due to the proximity to the mine, which recently was decommissioned. Furthermore, the community worries about this long-term environmental degradation and the possibility of contamination of traditional hunting and fishing grounds, which directly impacts not only their way of life, but sustenance. Concurrently, Attawapiskat has been living under an unceasing water crisis, a distressing fact of life that is reflective of a much larger systemic issue in Indigenous communities across Canada. The community, distressingly, has never known the luxury of unrestricted access to safe, clean drinking water, or maybe better put, the right to. At certain points, the water quality has been so compromised that residents are warned not to take showers or wash food because of the high levels of toxin present in the water. Water advisories, which have become part of daily life, ultimately signal the persistent neglect, infrastructural violence, and devaluation of Indigenous lives by government and industrial systems. It underscores the profound and systemic failing to uphold the basic right to water, including the rights to clean water, a failure to address the enduring impacts of colonialism, and a failure to uphold responsibility and fiduciary accountability to Indigenous peoples and our rights. The water issues in Attawapiskat are not just a local crisis, as many of you will know. They are a national shame reflective of a broader range of systemic injustices related to water violations and the kinds that Indigenous people in particular face across Canada. And while there has not been yet evidence of a direct link between the drinking water advisories in Attawapiskat and the extractive industrial industries in the area, including those which predate mining, looking at you, Hydro One, the issue has roots in a much larger systemic problem. The water difficulties largely stem from inadequate water infrastructure and ineffective treatment facilities that cannot ensure safe and clean drinking water. So mining activities such as those carried out by De Beers could potentially affect water qualities, but it's not been proven. And despite the lack of definitive link, it remains an area of significant concerns, one cited in more than one environmental impact assessment. It's essential that we recognize water issues such as these are entwined within a broader pattern of structural violence, the underfunding of infrastructure, concurrent with a push for the development of vital infrastructure in the region, like roads for trucks. The discrepancy between infrastructure and the allocation of government funds for major projects, it's noteworthy that places like Canada's Ring of Fire or the place where rivers meet have reportedly invested hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure for things like roads, but communities like Attawapiskat or Niskandaga and countless others are still waiting water after decades. Despite the repeated promises and allocation of funding, many communities continue to grapple with inadequate drinking water facilities and unsafe drinking water. And the stark contrast for me really highlights a deeply concerning disparity. The basic right to clean water is left unfulfilled while the desire, the seemingly unending extractive desire for wealth continues to be fulfilled. The land is in distress, and we as inhabitants are experiencing this pain with the current state of affairs. And equipped with the analytical insights of Indigenous feminist studies, I find myself asking, how does the experience of extractive colonialism manifest within us? What effects does the violence of infrastructural oppression have on our bodies? And more specifically, how does living under seemingly endless successions of not so exceptional states of emergency impact one's ability to visualize continued survival in a world that appears indifferent to the preservation of the planet? The findings from my applied research program offer some intriguing answers to this area, both in description and in theory. In 2002, along with my friend and colleague Annalise Cooper, we published a study exploring the co-occurrence of suicide in First Nations communities grappling with long-term drinking water advisories. And given what we already know about communities like Attawapiskat and from some qualitative evidence, there was a strong rationale to suggest that the infrastructural violence of failing water systems may be a significant risk environment for suicide in First Nations. There's a compelling argument that Infrastructural violence tied to failing water systems, could actually make you feel shitty. As I have reflected on elsewhere and most recently in a policy briefing with the Yellowhead Institute, concepts like Nibianje Bimadsuin, which teach us that water is life, or maybe more accurately, that water is living, remind us that our collective survival hinges on maintaining a healthy relationship with waterkin, to borrow terminology from Deb McGregor and Zoe Todd. Where violations against water occur, illness and death will follow, and that's what we see. Our study found that between 2011 and 2016, First Nations in Ontario with long-term drinking water advisories, that is, when a community has gone for over a year without clean water, First Nations in Ontario with these advisories report 50%, 50% of them are reporting suicides in the same period. And in contrast, only 15% of First Nations in Ontario without these advisories reported suicides in that same period. This is a statistically significant difference in proportions of suicide, and this proportion contrasts quite starkly with recent census data, which estimated that irrespective of water insecurity, there's only about 30% rates of proportion of suicides in First Nations in Ontario. What that in essence shows us is that those communities grappling with long-term drinking water advisories are more likely to have incidences of suicide. This is quite a unprecedented finding actually in Canada, because there's not been a lot of work that's tied this phenomena together. This particular research forms part of a larger project where we're investigating a host of concurrent environmental and infrastructural issues, including industrial pollution and the impacts of major water infrastructure development. And the second paper in this series, which is currently under review, spotlights very similar findings concerning First Nations communities in Ontario at different stages of implementing mining agreements with places like De Beers. The study unveils a statistically significant difference of 10% between the prevalence of suicides in communities under such agreements, so 51%, compared to those without mining exploration, about 41%. This is nearly 20% higher than the reported incidence rates by Stats Canada, census data of 29% of suicides in Ontario between 2011 and 16. Once again, while not as significant as water advisories, even something as maybe seemingly benign as being in a political agreement with a mining company is showing an enhanced context of risk. So descriptively, attending to environmental issues and infrastructural violence is helping us to better understand a broader constellation of factors intersecting with suicide in our communities. But I want to take a little bit of a closer look with you at the affective realities of that. How does it feel when the land, or in this case, water, is hurting? An issue that I know intimately affects rural communities throughout Manitoba and elsewhere in Canada. And to do that, I want to speak about a particular case in Ontario, one that I profile in a recent article, Hydrocolonial Affects, the Somotechnics of Long-Term Drinking Water Advisories in First Nations, which will be released in August in the Journal of Somotechnics. In this paper, I trace some of the history of water violations in Anishinaabe territory and the affective realities for folks living in Nisga'a First Nation, a community navigating a now 28-year-long drinking water advisory, the longest of its kind in Canada. And during the period of this drinking water advisory, the residents of Nisga'a have had to rely on water transported from a reverse osmosis system for drinking. This arrangement, put in place in 1995, was a stopgap measure following the government's failure to upgrade the community's water treatment system. In fact, historical research is showing us that Nisga'a actually never had clean water, once again. And before there was a water filtration system, the only place to access clean water was at the Indian agent's cabin. Seriously. Indeed, the water crisis in Nisga'a has been occurring alongside another persistent crisis, high rates of suicide. Emergency response coordinators have estimated that in 2012, the community was experiencing approximately 10 suicide attempts per month. The figure escalated by 2013 to 30 attempts per month of a community of 300 people. On April 17th in 2013, a state of emergency was declared after 7 people died by suicide in less than 4 months. And the situation intensified into 2016 with reports of an 11 suicide attempt in a day. More recently, between March and August of 2020, 10 individuals in the community lost their lives to suicide. And tragically, in the summer of 2022, a mother discovered that her 14-year-old child had died by suicide at the reverse osmosis site while she was out collecting water. This is the reverse osmosis site. Chris Munoz, the former chief of Niskandiga, communicated to the press at the time that the trauma in the community was caused by years of living without clean water. I think trauma is an important register to attend to here, and not in the clinical sense, but maybe the psychoanalytic sense, a catastrophic, world upending kind of sense. The scenario underscores that neither suicide nor water insecurity exists in the abstract, and Adela, you've said before, water has stories to tell. It situates suicide as the palpable traumatic consequence of water insecurity. A real felt manifestation of the crisis. And as Chen, MacLeod, and Yemis remind us, water must take up a body or a place somewhere, somehow. And all water insecurity is situated, bound to specific places and times, and influence real lives and bodies in profound and perhaps at times annihilating ways. I think here of the work of Kimembe. I think his work is particularly useful here, that the pervasive and persistent nature of such drinking water advisories on First Nations act as a form of slow violence. They create relentless conditions of debility. In these contexts, bodies of water, watersheds, the infrastructure necessary to drink from them, to clean them, and the people reliant on them are all affected by the violence of the state. The colonial machinery of occupation, commodification, pollution, and neglect reduces both Indigenous peoples and waters to expendable bodies, whose very right to exist is fundamentally called into question. The slow and relentless assault on Niskandiga's residents is brought to the fore by the fact that this young person had to source water from a system that was intended to be temporary 27 years ago, and their untimely death underscores how people's lives and health of bodies and the bodies of water themselves are intertwined sites of necropolitical brutality. In those First Nations where governments and industries have consistently neglected their responsibility to ameliorate the debilitating colonial conditions they've created, the presence of a reverse osmosis system may not symbolize relief. Instead, for some, it may be a stark reminder of the ongoing disregard for Indigenous life and the normalization of racialized violence in Canadian society. In Membe's perspective, necropolitical violence perpetrated by the state manifests in various forms, including small doses of death, forcing marginalized communities to subsist at the edge of life or even on its outer edge. And by considering this tragic loss as a form of theorizing Indigenous life, a reflection of understanding the world from the perspective of this young person, I think we can begin to see that the necessity of gathering small doses of drinkable water with no foreseeable permanent solution exemplifies slow violence. Water equates to life, but for us as Indigenous people, and for those of us living under long-term drinking water advisories, life is rationed out in increments equivalent to the contents of a plastic water bottle. Through mechanisms that reinforce the devaluation of Indigenous life, the necropolitics of colonialism transforms even those small doses of life into small portions of death. I want you to consider, too, the poignant words of Robert Spence, a citizen of Tastawayak First Nation in northern Manitoba, a community also grappling with the disproportionate high rates of suicide for over 30 years, and describing traumatic impacts of Manitoba Hydro's violence in the region across Nihil homelands and waters. My soul hurts and is dying. I feel as though I am mourning every day while being on the lake and the land. To live the life we as First Nations people, being as connected to the water and the land as we are, you kill the water, you killed the fish, you killed the Indian. In Spence's moving account, we hear an echo of Diane Million's assertion that Indigenous peoples feel our history, and that histories of our land offer a more complex telling of reality than is typically acknowledged. His words, marked by profound grief and loss, remind us of an intimate and indissoluble tie between land, water, and Indigenous life, and our well-being. When these vital relationships are violated, the consequences are not only physical, but environmental, emotional, and spiritual. They reverberate through us as people and our communities in distressing ways. So, nearing conclusion, I want to return to the question of how such an analysis should shape how we act to address suicide in the context of First Nations. How do such felt theories help us to build power and to resist colonialism? Anyone here who knows me or has experienced intimately life in the wake of suicide knows that there are no simple answers. So I won't pretend I have that answer fully developed, but it's something I'm working towards and will devote my life to. Drawing again from Diane Million, the argument that felt theories are integral to inform ourselves and our generations to counter and intervene in a constantly changing colonial system, I'd like to conclude by contemplating what suicide necessitates in terms of rectifying Canada. As Million claims, all felt theories are significant political interventions or counter-hegemonic moves. Suicide is a move. As an informative theorization of the living conditions of Indigenous people. I've tried to illustrate this by showing that suicide reveals the emotional repercussions of long-term states of environmental emergency, be it drinking water advisories or dust in the plumes of extractivism or Manitoba forest fires. These realities, as difficult as they may seem, can collectively guide action by those of us who continue to live in the world. And so here I want to leave you with a series of provocations. First, in a sense, I want us to rehabilitate the project of suicide prevention as a political one, where we understand that suicide, as it is affecting our communities, is an affect of and firmly contextualized within the project of settler colonialism and global extractivist capitalism. Second, we must consider how we can act at the specific sites and intersections highlighted by an Indigenous feminist perspective. This involves, yes, increasing mental health service accessibility, but it also means addressing racist environmental policy. It also means addressing deregulation and privatization. It also means addressing neoliberal infrastructural policy. It also means addressing the persistent material deprivation of Indigenous life, be it in social housing in downtown Winnipeg, or be that in water in Niskandiga. This deprivation is a result of a system purposefully designed to not only infringe upon and undermine our rights, but ultimately extinguish them. Rights pertaining to our lands, to water, and to basic human dignity. Third, following Jeff Corntassel's urging, we must recognize that self-determination is born from the courage and imagination to envision life beyond the state. Central to the issue of suicide is a question about sovereignty. Sovereignty of our bodies, of land, of water, and of our nations. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to dismantling necropolitical violence across all of these contexts. However, when suicide is interpreted through the lens of Indigenous feminist studies, it points towards the necessity of resistance against those systems intent on our extermination. A prevention model that seriously acknowledges these factors should be characterized by strategies that enhance the conditions of sovereignty within First Nations over land, water, and lives. Now, almost 30-year-old research by Michael Chandler and Christopher Lalonde highlights that strategies aimed at enhancing the rights and self-determination of Indigenous nations, be it in Indigenous-run health services, education, lands claims processes, and title processes, these in turn foster new relationships that are more conducive to living, or what they call a protective hedge against premature unnatural death. This means things like the implementation of Indigenous rights frameworks into law matter. It's why Indigenous governance of environmental impact assessment or environmental stewardship altogether matters. It's why housing, water services, and other fiduciary responsibilities of the federal government matter, because all of these things are part of ensuring Indigenous people's rights. And by extension, our lives are given the dignity of habitability. And so, in conclusion, I want to ask, what are the feelings of land and water? How do we know when the land is hurting? And so what? As I've tried to gesture towards, perhaps imperfectly, one of the complex things about suicide in our communities is that it's telling us something about the conditions of the planet. One, that it is alive. Two, that it is something we are in relationship with. And three, that there are wounds on our turtle's back that shape the possibility for all of our living. Death by colonialism is a shared condition between the human and the other, more and older than human life, be it air, water, land, deer, or forests. Under the violence of colonialism, we, that is, all of our relations on Earth, find ourselves on death's doorstep together. Against the splintering of relations, often perpetuated within the assessment of environmental impact assessments for resource development and infrastructure, or provincial and federal budgets, or even election promises, our feelings, even the suicidal ones, invite us to think in a manner that includes interconnected ecosystems, that there is no geographical region without people connected to it, and vice versa, to quote Kraft and Blakely. Within that sense of enmeshed land and body entails more consensual ways of being together, to quote Michelle Murphy. Indigenous studies of suicide ask us to be concerned not only with the preservation of our own life or the life of a dear loved one, but the life of a planet. To recognize and defend what is materially at stake in forming the possibility of a good life. Just as we mutually face the threat of annihilation together, we must also resist together. So what is a suicide prevention project like this in light of what we know about environmental violence? Well, it's the defense of land and bodies. Violence on the land is violence on the body, and violence on the body is violence on the land. So our task then is not only to survive, but to nurture the environment as we would our own bodies, or the bodies of those that we love. We must remember that as we draw life from the land, so too can we give life back to it, through preservation, through respect, and through care and remediation. In confronting the realities of suicide in our communities, we also must confront the violence of and against our earth. And understanding this as an interconnected site of struggle, one that we cannot separate, we must embody this understanding in our actions, our policies, our collective imagination, striving for a world where life in all its forms is valued and protected. In this pursuit, our feelings, whether joy, sorrow, rage, anger, or even suicidal feelings, or the pain and grief of living in the wake of suicide, become a compass, a guiding point, pointing us towards a more compassionate understanding of the delicate nature of our shared experience. And as we navigate those kind of complex terrains, let us remember this, that the defense of our land is the defense of our bodies, and that the defense of our bodies is ultimately the defense of our future. In the end, there is really no meaningful future without a healthy world to inhabit. We feel this truth. Do you feel that? Even now, as we breathe this smoky air, we must act. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I'm a remarkable call to action, call to thought, and call to the heart in so many ways. And I think you'll take some conversation.
Yeah, let's have some chit chat.
Let's have some chit chat.